sending submarines to Australia so that they will chase the Chinese around the Indo-Pacific. I mean, what is the idea?
I mean, that I wouldn't characterize it the way you've put it, Dana. We're not sending submarines.
Well, it's meant to be provocative, John. It's meant to be provocative.
I understand that. There is a program has been outlined, the detail of which, and the devil is always in the detail of which has yet to be hammered out, that the Australians will procure a number of SSNs using a power plant that is derived from the UK program or US program or the joint programs that have been running since the 1958 agreement to counter what China is seeking to achieve, which is a broadening of its sphere of control.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. Two terrific interviews this week. One, a former British submarine commander and retired Rear Admiral discussing nuclear risks at sea, and specifically the fury of France over a UK-US deal with Australia done behind France's back. A knife in the back, say French leaders. A provocation, say the Chinese. What's this all about? And the global supply chain you take for granted may be on the verge of collapse. Everything from food delivery to petrol to Christmas toys. A hangover from the pandemic that only seems to be getting worse. But first, submarines and Australia. All right, Rear Admiral John Gower, retired, is a former commander of two British submarines and former Assistant Chief of Defence Staff, Nuclear and Chemical Biological, in the UK Ministry of Defence. And he has just put together a report for Asia Pacific Leadership Network on the AUKUS deal. Hi, John.
Hello, Dana. Good to see you again. Of course, I must emphasize that it was co-authored with Tanya Ogilvie-White, who works directly for the APLN.
It's always an honor to talk to you. And what were the two British submarines? Do you remember the names of them?
Oh, I think so. I think I remember every ship and submarine I ever set foot on. I commanded HMS Unicorn, who was the last diesel submarine in the Royal Navy and is now HMCS Windsor in the Royal Canadian Navy, and HMS Trafalgar, who was the first of the Trafalgar class and is now Razor Blades.
In Razor Blades.
Yeah.
Most of us have no idea what submarines do in peacetime. And so what's it like spending a career on submarines? And tell us, I mean, what is the strategic game underwater? Is this hide and seek in peacetime played to what end?
Well, a multiplicity of ends, because a submarine can access international waters without raising tensions because it does so unobserved. And so if there are areas of international water that raise tensions, you can place submarines there routinely. So you would do that just to keep an eye on things. Secondly, you would want your submarines to be familiar with the waters in which they operate, which they may have to operate in tension and in war. Submarines are also extremely good at gathering intelligence because they do so unobserved, and therefore what they are watching doesn't change because they're there.
Right. Some of these submarines...
So all of those things are conducted by submarines, however they are propelled.
Right. And some of them are diesel and some of them are nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, I took HMS Unicorn into the Gulf and operated her in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf. And I took Trafalgar around the world under the ice through the Panama Canal and operated in the South China Sea and, in fact, visited HMAS Sterling in Perth, the main Australian submarine base today.
So what are we doing sending submarines to Australia so that they will chase the Chinese around the Indo-Pacific? I mean, what is the idea?
I mean, that I wouldn't characterize it the way you've put it, Dana. We're not sending submarines.
Well, it's meant to be provocative, John. It's meant to be provocative.
I understand that. There is a program has been outlined, the detail of which, and the devil is always in the detail of which has yet to be hammered out, that the Australians will procure a number of SSNs using a power plant that is derived from the UK program or US program or the joint programs that have been running since the 1958 agreement. This will replace the now aging Collins class submarines and deliver what Australia has always forecast the need to have a presence in the South China Sea and to its critical sea areas to the north, predominantly to the north of Australia. And it has always, because of its various governments' position on nuclear anything, whether it be power, weapons, or propulsion, has always up to this announcement plumped for the diesel electric solution to that operational need. But they've always recognised, or at least those who make the judgments on what is necessary, they've always recognised that delivers a suboptimal solution given the distances, predominantly the very large distances involved. And SSNs can get to places faster, and they can stay on station wherever they are for longer. The former is a product of being nuclear powered. The latter is partially that, and partially because they end up being bigger, so they can carry more food. And it's generally food that is what determines the endurance of a submarine. It's not the propulsion system per se.
China's really pushing out militarily. I mean, they have a huge military. People are worried about them just taking over the Indo-Pacific and doing whatever they want there around their neighbors. Their neighbors are nervous. Displacing submarines generally, whether it's Australia or whether it's any of the sort of, Western allies, if we want to call them that, is that a deterrent to China, where it says we're not abandoning the Indo-Pacific. We're not about to give you free rein to do what you want there. These are international waters.
Well, there was the very old Russian saying, I think it's attributed to Lenin or Stalin, but I'm not sure who, that if you push your bayonet at someone and you meet soft flesh, keep pushing. If you meet armor, stop. And so there is a deterrent effect to what is being done. AUKUS didn't specifically name China, but fundamentally, any analyst sees this as a means of increasing the burden sharing capability in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific to counter what China is seeking to achieve, which is a broadening of its sphere of control. It's doing it through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's doing it through economic means, but it's also doing it through an attempt to gain national control over international waters in the Spratlys and the Paracels and elsewhere. And this impinges not only on the AUKUS. In fact, it impinges more on the allies of the AUKUS who are around that South China Rim, whose national waters or economic zones lie within the area that China is seeking to control. And so the AUKUS announcement is a more general announcement about upping the ante a little bit to push back, not in a provocatively escalatory way, but to push back against what would otherwise be a simple Chinese building on top of success and gradually becoming unstoppable. And the submarines are the point of the AUKUS sphere, but AUKUS goes much broader than just buying submarines for Australia.
One of the organizations that has been pushing into the Indo-Pacific and has been pivoting maybe away from Russia and more towards China is NATO. So suddenly you have France, a key NATO member, one of them, angry about this deal with the Australians and the fact that the UK and the US seem to do it behind their back. According to the French, they say it's a knife in the back. So just before we get into the ins and outs of nuclear propulsion, submarines, just politically, don't you feel that this has caused a major rift in NATO and a very concerning one?
I think language like knives in the back and stabs in the back are make good headlines, but I'm not sure that's the enduring nature of the issues. I think it's absolutely clear that there were problems with these Australian-French submarine deal, whatever the optics have been presented since then. I think also, although I wasn't privy, obviously, to any of it, that at the macro level, or at the Macron level, you might say, the diplomacy of informing the French that the Australians were going to change heart in time for them to adapt to that was, well, frankly, inept. It just was not terribly well handled, and so you have this explosion on part of it, genuine. How can I trust you again? Fist shaking, but also a little bit of manufactured ire about how well the submarine deal was going before it was pulled out from under their feet. So I think there's a mix of that, and I don't think it's shattered NATO. NATO itself isn't really pushing into the Asia Pacific, but NATO members of NATO, UK, France, and the US, recognizing their desire to continue to have global influence. I mean, France has a history in the Indo-China region, as does the UK. So I think there is never room. There's never room for any dissent in NATO. It should never be fomented, because Russia is a past master at levering that. So that's regrettable. But I don't think as people settle down that that's going to be the serious issue. I think there will be some continued petulance, and I don't mean that but the French are angry, and they see they have a right to be angry, and that's going to continue. It's possible that out of this, the French will end up leveraging some pretty good results elsewhere geopolitically on the back of clearly both the UK and the US and Australia wishing to mend those fences. So I think my view is the French will box clever over the next few months, and although they may still smart over the submarine deal, I think they'll probably lever some diplomatic activity to get what they want elsewhere. So
a lot of arms control experts believe that France should be brought back into this, that the UK and the US just driving forward and ignoring the concerns raised by France and now the European Union, by the way, because as we speak, the European Union was supposed to be sitting down discussing a free trade deal with Australia today, and they suspended talks. So the EU has gotten behind France.
Yeah, and there is as I think, as if you read in the paper that we wrote, there is a sense that amongst a lot of the Asia Pacific nations that the EU's policy on Asia Pacific, which is some time old now, is much more inclusive and accepting of the needs and the primacy of the needs of the nations with whom it seeks to do business. Whereas you could read, if you were minded so to do, that the AUKUS was a little bit of an Anglophone imposed. This is how we, the three English-speaking nations, two of whom rim on the area, one is 10,000 miles away, feel that we should be doing business in the Asia Pacific. So I think there is some dissonance there. And I think some degree of post-announcement diplomacy, as always, is going to be needed. I think it is challenging to bring the French in, however, in that rather simplistic way, because you have to go all the way back to Suez to understand why UK and US are on one side and France is on the other, because UK and France went in together in Suez, and the US essentially slapped them both on the wrists and said, back off. And from that, in 1956, this is my judgment and others, the UK decided, we can't really do anything without being on side with the US, and followed that with the 1958 agreement, the Polaris Sales Agreement, the close linkage of intelligence communities, all of the special relations. And so the French reactor design, the whole methodology and everything to do with their ascent is very national, and the UK-US is very bilateral. So bringing the French in, so to speak, to the program has a number of challenges. It's not impossible, but it's not as simple as some of the commentators have indicated. It's not just a political decision.
Let's talk about Australia. Should Australia be trusted with highly enriched submarine power plants, nuclear power plants, that my understanding is that the same highly enriched uranium with some tweaks here and there can be used in weapons? So Australia has more of a past with seeking a nuclear program than some people might realize. And should they be trusted with this now?
Like there are many countries who in the past, and I'm talking the 60s, even before then, or up to the 70s, had either programs or investigations into whether they should become a nuclear weapon state. In fact, it was awareness of all of this that led to the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the 1970s as a way to try and stop all this speculation leading to proliferation. But they firmly said no. And I think the possibility that Australia would develop a weapons program because they had highly enriched uranium-fueled submarines is zero. So I don't have any problem. I don't see any path, politically or otherwise, for Australia to develop a weapons program because they have this weapons-grade uranium buried deep in the design and construction of the reactor. You cannot extract it in order to make weapons. So the problem is not what's in the reactors. You just simply can't, go in with a bucket and spade, take out the uranium and turn it into a weapon. That's fantasy. So the question is, well, how do they manage and own this submarine? And that's one of the things that's being looked at in the programmatic work that goes on in this 18 months. So there are a number of options, clearly. They could be like the US or the UK, where they own and manage the entire process from a bucket of uranium and lots of other bits of metal, and they build themselves a reactor, and they build themselves a submarine, and they put the two together, and they manage the fuel cycle from original enrichment to disposal. I think, whilst that is a possibility, I think that's extremely unlikely, given the Australian viewpoint on matters nuclear. So I think far more likely is that there will be, firstly, that the submarine core that they end up designing will be a lifetime core. So it doesn't need to be opened up and the fuel taken out and new fuel put in at some stage during the submarine's life. That's where the UK and the US have been going for some time in their design. So that removes the need to have that sort of interim infrastructure in Australia. Secondly, clearly you could, as was the case way back in the 1960s when the 58 agreement first provided a reactor to the British. It was essentially, I don't know if you remember the Thunderbirds, but Thunderbird 2, it was essentially a module that stuck in the middle of the submarine, and there was a British front end and a British machinery end and the American reactor end, and all they did was bolt all the bits together and weld up the hull. So that's an option, which is probably the most likely. It probably won't be as modular as that, but I think it is entirely possible to devise a submarine in a program where the reactor component, the nuclear component of it, comes as a single unit already sealed by the UK or US manufacturing company, and simply Australia runs it. And if there was any need to do anything to it internally, it would go back to the manufacturer, so to speak.
Okay, so that takes us around the risk with Australia to some degree of highly enriched uranium being used for a weapons program. So that there is, and we feel, according to you, you feel secure that Australia is a trusted partner. But what does it do?
Sorry, may I just elaborate slightly on that? That doesn't take away the fact that this is the first time that a non-nuclear weapon state will be an operator of a nuclear propulsion platform in a warship, in a submarine. And so there are precedents for other states for whom I may not have exactly the same confidence in their proliferation from a propulsion program to a weapons program. The door has been kicked slightly ajar.
Right. And where does that lead us? And that's the big concern by people who are worried about nuclear proliferation. South Korea would probably like nuclear submarines, to defend against North Korea, Japan, among others. And Russia, by the way, would probably be very happy to sell some of this.
Yes, as we've outlined in our paper, there is Brazil already has on record a nuclear program that is running itself. The the French are providing submarine design expertise to Brazil. But I must say, under some pressure over the years from the US, have not agreed, certainly in the past, to provide Brazil with any assistance on the nuclear propulsion side of their submarine program. But Brazil is going it alone. And the submarine that will be the first of class is due in the 2040s, about the same time frame as AUKUS predicts the Australian submarine to be coming into service. So Brazil clearly is a contender for some further assistance because they already have a program. And I think India has nuclear propelled submarines. Pakistan is clearly a proliferation contender there. And you've already mentioned ROC and Japan. I think both of them, they have some internal hurdles to overcome if they do that. And I think it is extremely unlikely that either of those countries would go anywhere other than the US for assistance in that program, given who their allies are. And I think it would be extremely unusual for either Japan or Korea to say, look towards Russia or China or someone else and not the US. So I think we can speculate all we want, but I think all as far as I would say is that the AUKUS deal for the submarines has kicked this door ajar, and that raises the hackles and the risk of the non-proliferation regime. It loosens the bounds of the non-proliferation regime on all of this, because it was pretty tight after 58 and after the NPT. It's been pretty tight in terms of proliferation of propulsion technology, largely because the countries who had it wanted to keep it secret for themselves. And then there was a non-proliferation spin-off that then meant they weren't going to give it to anyone else. So there is some risk and challenge here, and there's going to need to be some very careful diplomacy within the NPT following this to maximize the shutting down of the non-proliferation regime. And one of the ways in which AUKUS will do this is very clearly bounding the supply of the uranium that fuels the reactors in such a way that it is the least proliferation possible. In other words, the less that Australia can physically get its hands on it, the more the program would suit the non-proliferation community. But
Russia may not do the same, though.
Indeed. I mean, it's early to tell, but there is an additional risk. That is for sure.
Let's move on to the fact. Okay, they're not going to be armed with nuclear weapons in Australia. The UK have nuclear weapons on board their submarines. The US does. The Russians do. But they will be armed, as I understand, with cruise missiles. These submarines will be armed with cruise missiles, which have the potential to carry a nuclear warhead, even if they are not. And the problem is, with so many arms experts are saying that when you have cruise missiles flying around, when they are inbound, a country doesn't know whether they're armed with conventional or nuclear warheads, and that introduces a real threat of response.
Yes, I mean, just to be clear, the United Kingdom and the United States at the moment only has nuclear weapons in their ballistic missile submarines. And you simply can't fit a Trident D5 into an SSN. You probably could if you ripped everything out and lay it horizontally, but you couldn't fit it into. So the current nuclear weapons that are available to the US and the UK only fit in the SSBNs, and they're not going to Australia or deploying. I mean, the UK SSBNs aren't.
But they are designing new cruise missiles that can be nuclear.
The US has a program of record following the last NPR to reinvent essentially the submarine launched cruise missile that previously was the TLAM-N, which was first mothballed back in the 1990s and then effectively axed by the NPR under President Obama. Now, the new submarine launched cruise missile, SLCM-N, is not going to be a Tomahawk with a nuclear weapon on it. Probably it'll be a new missile, but it'll look awfully like a Tomahawk. The UK has no such program and will not place nuclear cruise missiles in its submarines ever, period. And it made that decision most recently in the Trident Alternatives Review that came out in 2013. But the US is, at the moment, following a program of record that will place the capability to put nuclear-armed cruise missiles in its submarines. And that's,
which means the Russians will do the same and are doing the same.
Russians already have. And therefore, the sale of the conventional Tomahawk land attack cruise missile to the Australians as part of the AUKUS deal, a missile which an earlier variant they have already sold and shared with the UK, means that submarines operating in the Asia Pacific will all be carrying, so all the AUKUS submarines will also be carrying the conventional Tomahawk missile, which at the moment is not an issue for this area of nuclear risk. But the moment that the US fields or has the capability to field a nuclear-armed submarine-launched cruise missile, then for all three nations, that changes. Or for all three nations, given that the most likely adversaries in the region are DPRK, North Korea, and China, both of whom are nuclear weapon or nuclear-armed states, you suddenly cannot launch your conventional cruise missiles anywhere near them for fear that they would misinterpret them as a nuclear launch and react accordingly. So that is why I and others have been calling regularly. In fact, an op-ed piece on The Hill just last week, or published earlier this week, talks about the cruise missile risk. In fact, using the fact that North Korea had announced a test of cruise missiles, not nuclear armed, but clearly with the potential so to be. And these dual-capable cruise missiles are probably the most destabilizing weapons in the nuclear weapon environment today because of this miscalculation risk. Most experts believe that the risk of nuclear conflict is not through the ego of a superpower that believes it can win a war. Indeed, Putin and Biden reiterated the Reagan-Gorbachev that a war could not be won, most recently in June of this year. It is through a miscalculated escalation that we stumble into nuclear exchanges and so on and so forth. And therefore, weapons that increase the risk of miscalculation should be removed from the orbit. So the sale of TLAM conventional to Australia for use in the Asia Pacific should be another reason why the US does not continue its submarine-launched cruise missile program, nuclear cruise missile program.
So you would tell President Biden and your Prime Minister Boris Johnson, think again.
Well, let me just be absolutely clear for the second time. The UK has no program and will have no program for a nuclear-launched cruise missile. This solely rests in Washington, this decision.
Right, but you're going together, but the UK is going together with the US to provide the launch platform to the Australians.
Yes, but we must not get confused between the fact that the AUKUS SSN and its conventional TLAM missile adds no more danger than the British SSN currently deployed in the region.
So they're not going to have crews on the Australian submarine.
They will, but this danger that I've just spoken to doesn't come into being until and unless the US deploys nuclear-armed submarine cruise missiles, which they currently do not have. They will not deploy these missiles in any other nation's submarines, but because when a TLAM missile leaves the surface of the sea, having left the submarine, it has no flags on it, and you don't know whether it's American, and you don't know what its payload is.
That's the point, John, isn't it? That
the only nation that can make
they are launching cruise missiles. They are launching cruise missiles from Australian submarines that are not nuclear tipped, but may well be mistaken for an incoming nuclear missile.
Precisely. The only nation that can change that miscalculation risk is the United States by stopping and not proceeding with its submarine-launched nuclear cruise missile program.
Would the French submarines have supplied cruise missile launch platforms as part of their submarine deal?
I don't know the answer to that question. The French have a nuclear cruise missile, but it is air-launched. They do not have and are not developing a maritime nuclear cruise missile.
So I'd ask you one more time, because I know we're out of time. Do you not think that by putting more cruise missiles out there, even if they're armed conventionally, and giving those to Australia on a submarine platform, whether it's nuclear driven or otherwise, that you are increasing the risk of somebody like North Korea seeing a launch as an incoming nuclear attack?
Not unless and until the US develops a nuclear cruise missile, because that is not present in that region at the moment. So the presence of cruise missiles, conventionally armed in Australian submarines, as they are currently today in British and American submarines, is a valid deployment. When you go back to the original question we asked at the beginning of this interview, why AUKUS? And it's about containing Chinese expansionist power. And conventionally armed cruise missiles are just part of the capabilities that you can present against this. The risk of it becoming a nuclear miscalculation only comes into play if the United States proceeds with its current program to reinvent a nuclear submarine launched cruise missile, which I advocate them not to do.
But under President Trump, they made the decision to go ahead with it, and it seems inevitable now, unless Biden turns it back. But retired Rear Admiral John Gower, always a pleasure to talk to you. Always a school day for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana.
All right, let's talk about supply chains now with Patrik Berglund, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Oslo-based Xeneta. Hi, Patrik.
Hi, Dana. Thanks for having me on.
So you're a leading ocean and air freight benchmarking and market analytics platform. So you're the guy that can tell me what in the heck is going on with global supply chains, because as of this week, we have warnings to the UN General Assembly now that the supply chain system, the global transport system, may collapse. I mean, this is very serious.
Yeah, it's a lot of different things in play at once, right? And the sort of the output of a series of events that actually has gone on for decades is sort of accumulated in this perfect storm that sort of COVID initiated. And from sort of when COVID hit, it was a sequence of events that has basically caused supply chain disruption, one after another, and of significant proportions, right? And let me give you a few examples. We've had COVID in the beginning of 2020, right? Mm-hmm. Then Brexit followed right after. That's when they stepped out of the EU, right? Then we had port strikes on the East Coast, US, and then we had Ever Given blocking the Suez Canal. We've had COVID lockdowns in Yantian, Ningbo. We've had Shanghai airport shut. We've had typhoon season. We've had south of Vietnam shut down to COVID. We have several hundred massive vessels around the world stuck, and a vast amount on US West Coast, but also on the East Coast, also in Far East Asia. And these congestions, right? They're happening because of these events that I mentioned, but also because there's.
By the way, that's a long list. I thought there were a couple in there, but I mean, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK would tell you it has nothing to do with Brexit, by the way. But here we are. Yeah, that's a long list of multi-layered problems that are adding up, and suddenly I'm spending an hour looking for gas for my car in the UK, and it is not entirely divorced from Brexit or from all these different problems.
Let me give you an example how connected it is. Think about these container boxes. They deliver 70% of global trade, right? 70% of global trade goes in these Lego boxes. It's the main artery of the global economy. It's what enables our lives to be how they are, for us to buy the products that we're buying at the prices we're getting them at the stores. Now, every one of these containers every year makes about, let's say, 6-7 trips, maybe as much as 8 during the course of a year. In today's market, they make between 2 to 3 because of all the congestions. And if you just think about that, if it's required for them to make 7-8 in order for world trade to sort of float, right? Then you can imagine how bad and severe these congestions and the limitations in the supply chain, whether it's driver shortages or whether it's these events that I mentioned that is just clogging the system. But this is what's going on overall, right? And this is making these boxes stuck either at sea or at the ports because there's not enough capacity and workers and everything to take out these boxes from the ports.
Let's talk about sea, since we're there. I didn't realize that early in the pandemic, and I was reading through some of the material, that many seafarers agreed to extend their contracts by several months to keep supplies of food, fuel, medicine, and other consumer goods flowing around the world. These guys essentially on ships were not allowed to land. They couldn't leave the ships. At the peak of the crisis in 2020, 400,000 seafarers were unable to leave their ships for routine changeovers, some working as long as 18 months beyond the end of their initial contracts. I had no idea that was going on.
Yeah, and really, if you think about it, they're one of these sort of unsung heroes of this pandemic, to be honest. Like the pain that a lot of these families has gone through, haven't seen their family members for months and months. It's an absolute disaster. And when the sort of pandemic was at its worst, when there was the most sort of uncertainty, and we're talking like after summer of last year, and the period after, there was no government even stepping out, sort of saying like you can change the rotation of the staff at our ports. On the contrary, everybody was saying we will not allow these vessels in if they start taking off unarmed people.
Go away because you're a risk.
And it is bizarre because what we talk about now is that we're dependent on this machinery to sort of run, right? And there's been nobody there to help them. And I think,
What happened to these workers? And I shouldn't say guys, there are women that work in the trade as well. These guys and gals who said, you know what? I don't make a lot of money in the first place.
Yeah.
To hell with this. And they left. I mean, many of them left those jobs.
Yeah, but a lot of them couldn't even get off the vessels. I personally know of people who's been stuck and haven't been able, like would be willing to leave the vessels, leave the business and industry entirely, but there was no way where they could legally offboard their vessels, right, and get back home. That's how bad it was in when the pandemic was at sort of the peak uncertainty period, right?
Well, it's great for. I don't want to put in black humor here, but it's probably great for an employer because your employees can't leave you at that point, right?
Yeah. And I think if I've seen anybody sort of vocal about this, it's actually been the shipping lines from a positive sort of aspect here, where they've been trying to flag this, raise attention to this situation and really show the gratitude to their employees to what they've been able to.
So government's borders essentially ignored the human part of that supply chain. So what happened to that? What happened to those people working in that end of the supply chain on those ships? Have they stayed? Have they recovered and come back, or have a lot of them just left?
There's a combination of many things, but at present there isn't a critical like shortage of seafarers comparable to what you can see, for instance, of truck drivers in the US or in the UK.
Let's talk about the truck drivers then, because here, just in the UK alone, they're saying there's 100,000 shortfall.
Yeah.
And I believe that's just fuel workers. I believe that's HGV drivers, as they call them. And they are saying that a lot of that some of them have gone to food supply companies instead of hauling around these bombs on wheels, which it's a high risk job. And the fact that there were not any testing going on in this sort of year and a half, so they haven't supplied a lot of those workers, and some of them, because of Brexit, have gone home. There is a question in here.
Yeah.
So, and that is the government just kind of, they knew it was eroding, that the workforce was leaving, but they did nothing.
Yeah, and I think what we're a little bit also seeing now is like the ultimate sort of like supply and demand situation. I know for a fact now that truck drivers in the UK can make north of $100,000 a year now on an annualized basis. And I believe the same challenge we see on the ocean side as well, just to give you a little bit of context and then link it to why this is problematic for you and me. Because when you get these capacity squeezes, what happens is that prices skyrocket, right? And when it back in the days was, let's say, a more normal price to pay about $1,500, $2,000 to go either Asia to Europe to Felixstowe or Rotterdam or to Los Angeles. Now it can be $15,000 and $20,000, and not
10
only
times.
And not only are we then seeing a significant cost increase, but we're also seeing a shortage. So as shelves starts to empty, my concern is that goods are going to be much more expensive for you and me, right? And that these costs will be passed on to the end consumer because these companies can't simply absorb them. I know several low-value commodity companies that can't live with these cost increases unless they push these increases onto the consumer.
How would you absorb 10 times the salary that you're having to pay people?
Yeah,
you're going to pass that along, and that's going to go in shipping cost. And the end product, whatever that be, whether it be a can of soup on the grocery shelf, or whether it be maybe fuel, even which is slightly more complicated, you're going to pass that to consumers who are already because of loss of jobs and problems from the pandemic are already struggling with employment and the ability to pay their bills.
Yeah, and here's where you face a lot of interesting conundrums, like the shipping lines. There's 3 alliances that control more than 90% of global volume, right? They, in the last quarter, they made a bigger profit than they did for the last 10 years in combined, right? So which kind of incentive do they have to sort of try and alleviate and sort of ease the situation, right? And so it's fascinating to watch and see this sort of unfold and unravel. And it's hard to see any relief on the horizon. And I'm slightly worried, to be honest.
I mean, I watched you do another interview, and tell me if I was wrong, but I almost caught the suggestion from you that those 3 companies may be price gouging right now and enjoying the ride.
Ooh, this is a thin line to walk. So I don't think you need to price to collude on prices when there's so few players. And this is important. It's about 10 shipping lines that's gone into 3 alliances. So they are collaborating on capacity. But I believe when a certain market that is like open and you have plenty of competition and this is true, like over the last 30 years, the top 5 shipping lines in the world has gone from controlling about 20% approximately of the over deep sea connections, and now it's 70+% on the top 5, right? So you've had mergers and consolidation, and then you've had bankruptcy because the market conditions has been weak. At the end of that storyline, you end up with few players that don't need to talk about pricing, but they still control the market. And it's bad for the end clients, in this case, meaning all the cargo owners, all the big importers, all the big exporters, and us as consumers.
In effect, you get a bidding war between companies for employees as well, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't suggesting collusion, by the way, but are they doing their best to keep the prices down?
Yeah, it's I'm smiling. I mean, this industry has been historically penalized for things like this, and that's not secret, and not a secret. But for the last 5 to 10 years, things seems to be in better shape.
In the UK, how much of this is about Brexit, do you think? About Britain's leaving the European Union, and a lot of truck drivers saying, I'm going home because I can make the same money in Slovakia or Poland or elsewhere.
Yeah, I think Brexit, it's a bit unfortunate for Brexit that COVID came, to be honest, because I believe that it's like stirring things up even more than it would have been. And, whether it's a shipping line thinking about whether it should have a loop that goes, Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Felixstowe, for instance, then it's more likely to cut off Felixstowe with Brexit happening than it was prior, right? So whether you look at truckers or whether you look at any mode of transportation to import-export cargo, it's not favorable for the UK at the moment. They need to get all operations running more smoothly. That's part of the problem, right? So I guess I would peg quite a lot of the challenges on Brexit, and then I would say it's enhanced and gotten worse because COVID also hit us.
All right, I don't want to make this too UK centric because let's just now step out into the rest of Europe. My understanding is there's a shortage of truck drivers everywhere.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and even in the US, it's a big discussion topic, and that's where you get these absurd situations where the pay goes through the roof, right? And I guess it will take time to get more truck drivers educated and into the market. So on the other side, we would be looking for a reduction in consumption in order to find any relief for the industry, and it doesn't at the moment seem very likely, right? Because
reduction in consumption.
Yeah, meaning what you and I buy. Think about this. This is what happened when COVID hit. You and I both immediately held back our spending. We were worried, what is going to happen? That's the first thing. I can personally remember this in March, questioning, okay, what is going to happen? Right. The vast majority of people at that point reduce their consumption. They buy less stuff. They're fearing for what's coming. Will I retain my job?
Which is the last thing you want if you're running an economy, for people to continue to hold back because you're trying to get economies running again.
Yeah. And think about this. As a response to this, the shipping lines actually took out 30% of capacity, almost 30% of the capacity on a global scale out of the market because they thought less goods would move. Then comes summer, right? By that time, you and I figured out that we're not losing our jobs, and there's governmental support schemes in place, and people had more money to spend, but they could not go travel. They could not go even get a haircut, right? So what happened is that we started ordering more, and we ordered more on a market that had reduced capacity, right? And that's just like the ramp up to when all of these other events that we talked about in the beginning happen. So all of this just comes together. And I don't care if it's Australia, US, Canada, or UK. We're all depending on these boxes and these vessels floating around in this fairly free sort of manner. But they're just stuck everywhere, whether it's the driver shortage that we talked about, or whether it's a lack of crane operators, right? Anything really.
Take me forward with your crystal ball a little bit, and you said it's the perfect storm. I spent time in Florida where hurricanes blow through pretty quick. This doesn't sound like a temporary problem.
No, I do not believe that we will see any particular relief in this in the near term. You could hope that things like Chinese New Year or stuff like that could ease the situation a bit. But my main worry is that the shipping lines have learned to control capacity because they've seen how much money they can make, literally, by having some level of constrained capacity. And that makes me think that we probably need to go into mid-2022 before we can even see maybe some relief going into 23. On top of that, what really is needed is infrastructure investments, in particular in the US, where the congestions are absolutely horrible at the moment. And from the time those decisions are made to when it's actually improved is many years, right?
Many years, and in the meantime, the companies are profiting and quite comfortable with their profit margins.
Yeah, well, some of them, but think about just think about companies like IKEA, Walmart, Amazon, anything, Disney, Colgate, you name it. Any company that moves product, they're worried about how they're going to keep their supply chains intact. Whether it's chemical companies, automotive companies, FMCG, all of them, they struggle with this, right?
Last question: is there a way of a government or a person, for that matter, insulating themselves from some of this?
It's very hard for a person to insulate themselves from this. But I mean, and this is what I a little bit like about the global sort of environment that we've grown to become, where we all sort of dependent on each other's nations to create economic growth for each other. And I think government can play a huge role in stepping in and get ports and railroads and everything running on a 24/7 basis. There could be, and there is already attempts of that for governments to step in and try to increase the throughput of the ports and so forth, right? So there's things that can be done. And I genuinely hope so, that there will be more laws passed and more flexibility given and stimulus to really unbundle some of these congestions and problems that we're seeing at the moment. And I believe if we do that, and if there is some reason for the consumption that you and I am currently doing would reduce, that would be helpful. Like, for instance, a summer period with more vacationing, right? So on a global scale, which, doesn't seem very likely at the moment. We would need COVID situation to change a bit. Vaccinations need to be spread throughout the world and not only in the Western part of the world. So yeah, a few things that can come together to improve the situation, but no immediate results from them.
It's so interesting, Patrik, because sitting here in the UK, I watched them line up at the borders, crossing the channel, truck drivers crying that they couldn't, they just weren't being treated properly. They weren't being cleared through. They were spending days in some of those lines along the highways. They couldn't get vaccines. Vaccines were considered somebody else's problem. It really shows you, just as you mentioned, how global all of this is tied together, and even just getting vaccinations to people so that they can, who are working in the global supply chain, can continue to work and continue to bring the goods that people want. Yeah. Patrik Berglund, the CEO of Xeneta, really great to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on, Dana. Really a pleasure.
Take care.
Take care.
And that's our backstory this week. Here in the UK, I spent an hour waiting for gas after spending an hour cruising for a gas station that was even open. There's a lot of Brexit and Britain's decision to leave the EU at play. It's not a disaster in the making, but a disaster playing out now. Watching dwindling food supplies, a lack of gas, and prices rising just when people can't afford it after they lost jobs in the pandemic. Thanks for listening to Backstory. Please share our link. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.